Aldrics True Love, Paris, 1919. Helene Caron caught a glimpse of a fading silhouette near an ancient monument, marked with the date 1918 and the name Corporal Etienne Dubois, a spectral figure lost in time. Chapter 1. The Lingering Ghost of Yesterday. The Parisian air hung thick with the scent of rain and regret, a familiar perfume for the spring of 1919. Helene Caron clutched her worn shawl tighter, the damp chill seeping into her bones, mirroring the coldness that had settled in her heart since the armistice. The city, though jubilant in its newfound peace, still bore the scars of war, much like Helene herself. Buildings stood pockmarked with bullet holes, their facades like wounded faces staring blankly at the bustling crowds. The laughter and chatter of the returning soldiers and celebrating citizens seemed to bounce off Helene, leaving her isolated in a silent bubble of grief. She paused before the weathered monument in the Place de la Concorde, a temporary structure erected to honor the fallen. It was a haphazard collection of stone and hastily carved names, a testament to the overwhelming scale of loss. Her fingers, roughened by years of work as a seamstress, traced the inscription that had drawn her here, day after day, for the past week. Corporal Etienne Dubois, 1918. The date, a cruel reminder of the year her world had shattered. It wasn't the name itself that captivated her, it was the silhouette. A trick of the light, perhaps, or the way the setting sun cast shadows across the monument. But for a fleeting moment, each evening, she saw him. A faint outline of a man in a soldier's uniform, his head slightly bowed, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that transcended even death. It was just a flicker, a phantom impression lasting only seconds, but it was enough to ignite a desperate hope in Helene's heart. She had known a Corporal Etienne Dubois. Her own loss, her fiancé, Jean-Luc, a cartographer conscripted into the artillery, had fallen at Verdun in 16. The telegram announcing his death had been stark, devoid of the flowery prose officials often used to soften the blow. Killed in action. No remains recovered. The words had been seared into her memory, a brand she carried with her always. Yet, this spectral soldier, this Etienne, stirred something within her, a flicker of recognition that defied logic. Helene was not a woman prone to fancies. She was grounded, practical, her life shaped by the harsh realities of working-class Paris. She'd learned to bury her emotions deep, to present a facade of stoic resilience to the world. But the silhouette, it chipped away at her carefully constructed defenses. It whispered of unfinished business, of a story untold. She'd first noticed it a week ago. While returning home from a late shift at Madame Dubois' no relation, Helene fervently hoped dress shop. The setting sun had painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, casting long, dancing shadows across the square. And there he was, a fleeting impression against the stone, gone before she could fully register what she was seeing. She dismissed it as exhaustion, a trick of the weary mind. But the next evening, and the evening after, he reappeared. Each time, the same posture, the same haunting sadness. Tonight, the air was particularly heavy, the clouds threatening another downpour. Helene lingered longer than usual, her gaze fixed on the spot where Etienne's silhouette would appear. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure an image of Jean-Luc, to feel the familiar ache of his absence. But all she saw was the blurred outline of the unknown corporal. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the square, scattering fallen leaves and swirling dust. Helene opened her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There. For a heartbeat, he was there. Clearer than before, almost solid. She could almost make out the details of his uniform, the way his hand seemed to clench at his side. And then, just as quickly, he was gone, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. A woman bumped into Helene, her sharp pardon, Madame jolting her back to reality. Helene mumbled an apology, her cheeks burning with a strange mixture of embarrassment and hope. It was foolish, she knew. A ghost story to comfort a grieving heart. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to see him, that Etienne Dubois, or rather his lingering essence, had a message for her. She looked around the square, at the couple strolling arm in arm, the children chasing pigeons, the vendors hawking their wares. Life went on, oblivious to her private turmoil, to the spectral soldier who haunted her evenings. Helene sighed, the weight of her solitude pressing down on her. She had no one to share this strange, unsettling experience with. Her mother, frail and increasingly withdrawn since Jean-Luc's death, would dismiss it as nerves. Her friends, preoccupied with their own post-war struggles and joys, wouldn't understand. But tomorrow, she decided, she would do more than just look. She would investigate. She would find out who Corporal Etienne Dubois was, and why his ghost, if that's what it was, seemed so determined to be seen by her. The thought, both terrifying and exhilarating, settled in her stomach, a knot of anticipation that tightened with each step she took towards home, the silhouette of the unknown soldier imprinted on her mind, a promise and a mystery waiting to be unraveled. The rain began to fall, a soft, steady drizzle that washed over the city, cleansing the streets and, perhaps, offering Helene a sliver of hope in the lingering ghost of yesterday. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parisian Twilight. The following day dawned gray and somber, a mirror of Helene's mood. Sleep had eluded her, replaced by a restless tossing and turning punctuated by fragmented dreams of blurred faces and whispered names. She rose early, the scent of stale coffee and damp wool filling her small, one-room apartment in the Marais district. The building, once grand, now bore the faded elegance of a bygone era, its walls echoing with the whispers of countless lives lived and lost. Helene dressed quickly, choosing a simple gray dress and a sturdy pair of boots. She needed to be practical, to move through the city unnoticed. Her plan, such as it was to start at the most obvious place, the Ministry of War. Surely, they would have records of a Corporal Etienne Dubois. The thought of navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the French government was daunting, but the image of the silhouette, the haunting sadness in its posture, spurred her on. As she walked, the city slowly awakened. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts, delivery boys hauled crates of fresh produce, and the early morning trams clattered along the cobblestone streets. Paris was a city of contrasts, of opulent beauty and gritty reality, of joyous reunions and silent grief. Helene felt a kinship with the city's hidden wounds, the scars that lay beneath the surface of its vibrant facade. The Ministry of War was a colossal building, its imposing architecture designed to intimidate and impress. Helene felt a surge of apprehension as she approached the entrance, the heavy oak doors seeming to guard a fortress of secrets. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and old paper. Clerks bustled about, their faces set in expressions of weary efficiency. Long lines of people snaked through the vast hall, each person clutching a handful of documents, their faces etched with anxiety and hope. Helene joined the queue for inquiries, her heart pounding a nervous tattoo against her ribs. She rehearsed her request in her head, trying to sound confident and official. She would ask for information about Corporal Etienne Dubois, citing a family connection. A distant cousin, perhaps. It was a flimsy lie, but she hoped it would be enough. The wait was agonizing. Each tick of the clock seemed to echo the slow, relentless passage of time. Helene observed the people around her, their stories etched on their faces. A young woman with tear-stained cheeks, clutching a crumpled telegram. An elderly couple, their hands clasped tightly together, their eyes filled with a quiet desperation. A wounded soldier, his arm in a sling, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen horizon. Finally, it was her turn. The clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a perpetually tired expression, barely glanced at her as he asked, "Name?" "Helene Karen," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm inquiring about a relative. Corporal Etienne Dubois." The clerk tapped a few keys on a large, clunky typewriter, his fingers moving with practiced speed. He scanned the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. Helene held her breath, her hands clenched into fists. "Dubois, Etienne Corporal 1918, he muttered, his voice barely audible above the din of the hall. Ah, yes. Here it is. Helene's heart leaped with a mixture of excitement and dread. He had found him. What does it say? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The clerk looked up, his expression unreadable. Corporal Etienne Dubois. Declared missing in action, presumed dead. Near Reims, October 1918. Missing. Presumed dead. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Not dead, then. Not confirmed. A sliver of hope, however faint, pierced through the darkness. But missing where? And why had his silhouette appeared to her, so far from Reims, in the heart of Paris? Is there any further information? Helene asked, her voice pleading. Any details about his unit? His family? The clerk sighed, the sound weary and resigned. That's all the information we have, madam. Missing in action. The files are incomplete. So many records lost, destroyed, you understand. Helene nodded, her mind reeling. She understood all too well. The chaos of war, the mountains of paperwork, the countless lives lost and forgotten. She thanked the clerk, her voice hollow, and stepped away from the desk, feeling lost and adrift in the sea of humanity. As she walked out of the ministry, the gray sky seemed to press down on her, suffocating her with its weight. Missing. The word echoed in her mind, a cruel taunt. It offered a glimmer of hope, but also a vast, unanswerable question. Where was he? She decided to walk back towards the Place de la Concorde, drawn by an invisible thread to the monument, to the place where she had seen his silhouette. The twilight was approaching, the sky beginning to blush with the colors of sunset. She found a quiet spot near the monument, leaning against a stone balustrade, watching the crowds go by. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the square, Helene waited. She closed her eyes, picturing the silhouette, willing it to appear. And then she saw it. Faint at first, a mere shimmer in the air, but then growing stronger, more defined. The soldier, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. This time, however, something was different. As she watched, the silhouette seemed to shift, to move. His head lifted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Helene thought she saw his eyes. Dark, haunted eyes, filled with a profound sadness. And then he was gone. But in that brief moment of connection, Helene felt a surge of certainty. He was trying to tell her something. He was reaching out to her, across the void between the living and the dead. And she, Helene Karen, was the only one who could hear his whispers in the Parisian twilight. The question was, what was he trying to say? And how could she possibly find him, a ghost lost in the aftermath of a brutal war? Chapter 3. A relic of scars and secrets. The next morning, Helene awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The fleeting glimpse of Etienne's eyes, the way his silhouette had seemed to look at her, had solidified her resolve. She wouldn't be deterred by bureaucratic dead ends or the whispers of her own doubt. She would find out what happened to Corporal Etienne Dubois, even if it meant unraveling a mystery that spanned the battlefields of France and the hidden corners of Paris. She decided to revisit Madame Dubois' dress shop. Not for work, but for information. Madame Dubois, though not related to the mysterious corporal, was a font of local gossip and knowledge. She knew everyone and everything that went on in the neighborhood, and perhaps, just perhaps, she might have heard something about a soldier named Etienne. The shop was bustling with activity, the air filled with the rustle of silk and the chatter of women discussing the latest fashions. Madame Dubois, a stout woman with a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue, greeted Helene with a raised eyebrow. "Helene, my dear, back so soon? And on your day off? To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Helene forced a smile. "Madame Dubois, I was hoping you might be able to help me with something. It's a personal matter." Madame Dubois' eyes narrowed, her curiosity piqued. "Personal, you say? Do tell. I have a nose for secrets, you know." Helene took a deep breath. "I'm trying to find out about a soldier. Corporal Etienne Dubois. He was reported missing in action." Madame Dubois tapped a finger against her chin, her brow furrowed in thought. Dubois, the name rings a bell, but, wait. There was a young man, Used to come in here with his mother, years ago. Before the war, of course. A handsome lad, quiet but polite. His mother was a regular customer, always buying the finest fabrics. But I haven't seen them since the war started. Helene's heart quickened. Do you remember anything about them? Where they lived? Anything at all? Madame Dubois pursed her lips. Let me see, they lived somewhere near the Canal Saint Martin, I believe. A small apartment above a bakery. The mother's name was Marie. Yes, Marie Dubois. A lovely woman, but always seemed a bit melancholy. The Canal Saint Martin. Another piece of the puzzle. Helene thanked Madame Dubois profusely, her mind already racing ahead. She left the shop, the scent of perfume and fabric clinging to her clothes, a faint reminder of the normalcy she was leaving behind. The Canal Saint Martin was a picturesque waterway lined with trees and charming old buildings. It was a working-class neighborhood, a world away from the grandeur of the Place de la Concorde. Helene walked along the canal, her eyes scanning the buildings, searching for a bakery. She found it eventually, a small, unassuming shop with a faded sign that read Boulangerie Dubois. The windows were dusty, the display cases empty. It looked abandoned. Helene's heart sank. Had she reached another dead end? She tried the door, but it was locked. She peered through the grimy windows, trying to see inside. The interior was dark and cluttered, the remnants of a once thriving business. A layer of dust covered everything, a silent testament to the passage of time. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small, elderly woman sitting on a bench across the street, her gaze fixed on the bakery. She was dressed in black, her face etched with a deep sorrow. Helene hesitated, then approached her. "Excuse me, madam," she said softly. Do you know anything about this bakery? The Dubois family?" The woman looked up, her eyes, red-rimmed and weary, met Helene's. "The Dubois?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "They're gone. All gone." Helene's heart ached for the woman, for the unspoken grief that hung heavy in the air. "Gone? What happened?" The woman sighed, a long, shuddering breath. "The war, my dear. The war took everything. Marie's son, Etienne, he was a soldier. He never came back. And Marie, she couldn't bear it. She gave up. Withered away like a flower deprived of sunlight." Helene felt a cold hand grip her heart. So, Etienne's mother was dead. Another victim of the war, claimed not by bullets or bombs, but by a broken heart. "I'm so sorry," Helene murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The woman looked at her, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Why are you asking about them? Did you know Etienne?" Helene hesitated. How could she explain the silhouette, the haunting visions, the inexplicable connection she felt to a man she had never met? She decided to tell a partial truth. I found something that belonged to him," she said, her hand instinctively reaching for her pocket, where she had tucked a small, tarnished object she had found near the monument the previous evening. It was a locket, a simple silver heart, engraved with the initials ED. She had found it lying on the ground, half hidden beneath a fallen leaf, as if it had been waiting for her. The woman's eyes widened as Helene held out the locket. That's Etienne's," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He always wore it. A gift from his mother." Helene carefully opened the locket. Inside, there were 2 miniature portraits. One was of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Marie Dubois, no doubt. The other was of a young man in a soldier's uniform, his gaze direct and unwavering. It was Etienne, the same Etienne she had seen in silhouette, the same haunting eyes that had met hers for a fleeting moment. The woman reached out and touched the locket, her fingers tracing the outline of Etienne's face. "He was a good boy," she said, her voice choked with tears. "A good son. He didn't deserve this." Helene felt a surge of empathy for the woman, for the shared grief that bound them together. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this locket, this relic of scars and secrets, was the key to unlocking the mystery of Etienne Dubois. It was a tangible link to the past, a whisper of a life cut short, a promise of a story waiting to be told. And she was determined to follow that whisper, to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The old woman looked up, a glimmer of something akin to hope flickering in her eyes, a question unspoken but hanging heavy in the air between them. Chapter 4. The Unsent Letters of Etienne Dubois. The old woman, whose name was Madame Moreau, a former neighbor and close friend of Marie Dubois, invited Helene back to her small, cramped apartment. It was a modest dwelling, filled with the scent of lavender and old memories. Photographs lined the walls, a silent testament to a life lived and loved, now tinged with the sepia tones of loss. Madame Moreau, after brewing a pot of weak tea, carefully placed a small, wooden box on the table between them. After Marie passed, she explained, her voice trembling slightly, I couldn't bear to see her belongings discarded. I kept a few things, mementos, you understand. She opened the box, revealing a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. These are Etienne's letters. From the front. Marie cherished them. Read them aloud to me, every week. After the telegram came, she couldn't bear to look at them anymore. Helene's hands trembled as she reached for the letters. They were worn and fragile, the ink faded in places, bearing the smudges of time and travel. These were more than just words on paper, they were fragments of a life, echoes of a voice silenced too soon. She carefully untied the ribbon and selected the first letter, its date marking it early in Etienne's service. My dearest mother, Helene began, her voice soft and hesitant, reading Etienne's words aloud. The journey here was long and arduous, but I am well. The men are a mixed lot, some eager, some terrified. I try to remain hopeful. The countryside is beautiful, though marred by the signs of war. We are training hard, preparing for what is to come. I miss you dearly. I miss your cooking, your smile, your gentle touch. I carry your locket always, close to my heart. It gives me strength. I pray for a swift end to this madness, so that I may return home to you, safe and sound. Your loving son, Etienne. Helene continued reading, letter after letter, unfolding Etienne's journey through the war. His initial optimism slowly faded, replaced by a weary resignation, a quiet determination to endure. He wrote of the horrors he witnessed, the constant fear, the loss of comrades. He wrote of the mud, the cold, the relentless shelling. But through it all, his love for his mother shone through, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He never mentioned a lover, a sweetheart waiting for him. Only his mother. Several letters, however, were different. They were unopened, still sealed with their original wax. Madame Moreau explained, her eyes filling with tears. Those were returned. Unsent. After he was reported missing. Helene carefully picked up one of the unsent letters. It was addressed not to Marie Dubois, but to someone named Mademoiselle Sophie L. The handwriting was the same, Etienne's distinctive script, but the tone was different. More intimate, more vulnerable. With Madame Moreau's permission, Helene gently broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My dearest Sophie, she read, her voice catching in her throat, I write to you under the cover of darkness, the only time I feel truly alone, truly myself. The days here are a blur of noise and chaos, of fear and death. But when I close my eyes, I see your face, I hear your voice, and I am transported back to Paris, to our secret meetings, to the stolen moments of joy we shared. You are my sanctuary, my reason to fight, my hope for a future I fear I may never see. I know our love is forbidden. Your family my duty, but I cannot deny the truth of my heart. I love you, Sophie. More than words can say. I dream of a day when we can be together, openly, without fear. Until then, I carry your love with me, a secret flame that burns bright in the darkness. Your devoted, Etienne. Helene's heart ached for Etienne, for the secret love he had carried, a love that had been both his solace and his burden.
Sophie. Who was she?
And why had their love been forbidden? The letter raised more questions than it answered. The existence of the returned letters painted a more rounded version of the man. He wasn't just a devoted son. He was a man of secret passion, of a love seemingly doomed from the start. Madame Moreau, Helene asked softly, do you know anything about a Sophie? Someone Etienne might have been close to? Madame Moreau shook her head, her brow furrowed in thought. Sophie, no, I don't recall him ever mentioning anyone by that name. Marie never spoke of it either. It must have been a secret. A very well-kept secret. Helene carefully folded the letter, her mind racing. She had found another piece of the puzzle, a vital clue that could lead her closer to the truth. She needed to find Sophie. She needed to understand the nature of their relationship, to unravel the mystery of Etienne's disappearance. But where to begin? The letter offered only a surname initial, L. Paris was a large city, filled with countless women whose names began with L. As Helene left Madame Moreau's apartment, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the Canal Saint-Martin. She clutched the unsent letter, Etienne's words echoing in her mind. His love for Sophie, his hope for a future that never came, his plea for a love that transcended the boundaries of war and societal expectations. She was more determined than ever to solve the mystery. It wasn't just about a ghost anymore, it was about a man, a life, a love story tragically cut short. And she, Helene Karen, would be the one to give it the ending it deserved, even if she needed to scour every inch of Paris. The very stones of the city felt like they whispered Sophie's name, a challenge and a beckoning all in one. Chapter 5. Shadows Across the Seine. The search for Sophie L. proved to be more challenging than Helene anticipated. The Parisian phone directory, a thick, unwieldy volume, listed dozens of women with the initial L, a daunting prospect even for the most determined investigator. She spent days poring over the names, cross-referencing addresses with the few clues she had gleaned from Etienne's letters and Madame Moreau's recollections. He had mentioned secret meetings and stolen moments of joy. Where in Paris would a young couple, bound by a forbidden love, find such moments? Helene started with the areas around the Canal Saint-Martin, Etienne's neighborhood. She visited cafes, parks, and small shops, discreetly inquiring about a young woman named Sophie L., who might have frequented the area before the war. But her efforts yielded nothing. People were either too busy, too wary, or simply didn't remember. The war had left its mark on everyone, their memories blurred by grief and loss. Frustrated, Helene decided to expand her search. She remembered Etienne mentioning, in one of his letters to his mother, a fondness for the Seine, for the way the light reflected on the water, for the boats that glided silently along its surface. Perhaps he and Sophie had shared moments there, along the riverbanks, hidden from prying eyes. She began to spend her evenings walking along the Seine, starting from the Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in Paris, and working her way eastward. The river was a constant presence in the city, a silent witness to its history, its joys, and its sorrows. Lovers strolled along its banks, artists sketched its ever-changing moods, and children played at its edge. Helene observed the couples she encountered, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of a story that might mirror Etienne and Sophie's. She watched the way they held hands, the way they looked at each other, the way they shared whispered secrets. But none of them seemed to fit the image she had formed in her mind, the image of a love born in secrecy, shadowed by the threat of discovery. One evening, as she was walking near the Isle de la Cite, the island that housed Notre Dame Cathedral, she noticed a small, secluded garden tucked away behind a row of ancient buildings. It was a hidden oasis, a place where one could escape the hustle and bustle of the city. The garden was overgrown, its flowers running wild, its benches weathered and worn. But it possessed a certain charm, a sense of timeless beauty. As Helene entered the garden, she noticed a young woman sitting alone on a bench, her gaze fixed on the river. She was slender, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, and dressed in a plain, dark dress. There was a sadness about her, a melancholic air that resonated with Helene. Could this be her? Helene hesitated, then approached the woman cautiously. "Excuse me, mademoiselle," she said softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." The woman looked up, her eyes, large and dark, met Helene's. There was a flicker of surprise, followed by a guarded reserve.
No, madame. You're not disturbing me.
Helene took a deep breath. I'm looking for someone. A woman named Sophie.
Sophie.
The woman's expression changed instantly. Her eyes widened, her face paling slightly. She seemed to shrink back, as if trying to disappear into the shadows of the garden. Sophie? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Why are you looking for her? Helene's heart quickened. She had found her. Or, at least, she had found a Sophielle. The reaction was too strong, too immediate, to be a coincidence. I have something that belongs to her, Helene said, her voice trembling slightly. Something that belonged to a friend of hers. A soldier. Etienne Dubois. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and touched Helene's arm, her fingers trembling. Etienne, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You knew Etienne? Helene nodded, her own eyes welling up. I'm trying to find out what happened to him. He was reported missing in action. The woman Sophie closed her eyes, her body swaying slightly. Missing, she repeated, the word a painful echo of Helene's own experience. I never knew. I thought. She opened her eyes, her gaze searching Helene's. He wrote to me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But the letters, they stopped coming. I assumed the worst. That he had been killed. Helene pulled out the unsent letter, the one addressed to Sophie, and handed it to her. He kept writing, she said softly. But his letters, they were returned. Unsent. Sophie took the letter, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it. She recognized Etienne's handwriting instantly, her fingers tracing the familiar script. Tears streamed down her face as she read the words, Etienne's words, his declaration of love, his plea for a future that never came. The shadows lengthened, casting an even deeper gloom over their shared sorrow, the Seine flowing silently by, a witness to their meeting, their shared loss, and the beginning of a fragile, tentative connection forged in the crucible of war's aftermath. The very air held its breath. Chapter 6. The Midwife's Forbidden Knowledge. Sophie's apartment, a small, sparsely furnished room above a flower shop near the Luxembourg Gardens, reflected the austerity of her life. The scent of lilies and roses permeated the air, a bittersweet reminder of beauty and fragility. The room was meticulously clean, but devoid of personal touches, save for a single, framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of Etienne, the same one Helene had seen in the locket, his eyes smiling, his arm around Sophie's waist. They looked happy, carefree, a stark contrast to the somber reality of their present. After reading Etienne's letter, Sophie had broken down, sobbing uncontrollably, the years of suppressed grief pouring out in a torrent of tears. Helene had held her, offering comfort and a shared understanding of loss. Now, as they sat together at a small table, sipping chamomile tea, Sophie began to tell her story, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength as she unburdened herself of the secrets she had carried for so long. Our families, they were enemies, she began, her gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame. My father, a wealthy industrialist, a staunch supporter of the war effort, a man of influence. Etienne's mother, a simple seamstress, a woman of modest means. They lived in different worlds, worlds that were not meant to intersect. Sophie explained how she and Etienne had met at a charity event, a gathering of the Parisian elite, where Etienne had been working as a waiter. Their eyes had met across the crowded room, a spark of attraction igniting instantly. They had begun meeting secretly, stealing moments together in parks, cafes, and along the Seine, their love blossoming in the shadows, hidden from the disapproving eyes of their families. We knew it was dangerous, Sophie continued, her voice trembling slightly. My father, he would never have approved. He had other plans for me. An arranged marriage, a union with a man of suitable social standing. Helene listened intently, her heart aching for Sophie, for the impossible choices she had been forced to make. She understood the pressures of societal expectations, the constraints placed upon women in that era. She herself had been expected to marry within her own social circle, to find a respectable, hard-working man who could provide for her. When the war broke out, Sophie said, her voice dropping to a whisper, Etienne, he felt it was his duty to enlist. He wanted to prove himself, to show my father that he was worthy. Foolish, I know, but he was idealistic. He believed that if he served with honor, my father might change his mind. Sophie paused, her gaze drifting to the photograph on the mantelpiece. I begged him not to go, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I told him it was madness, that it wouldn't change anything, but he was determined. He left with a promise, a vow to return to me, to fight for our love. The letters, Sophie explained, had been their lifeline, their only connection during the long, agonizing months of separation. She had treasured them, reading them over and over again, clinging to his words as a drowning man clings to a raft. But then, the letters had stopped. She had waited, prayed, hoped against hope, but no more letters came. She had contacted the Ministry of War, desperate for information, but they had told her only that he was missing, presumed dead. I gave up, Sophie confessed, her voice filled with a deep, abiding sadness. I believed he was gone. I tried to move on, to forget him, but I couldn't. He was a part of me, a part that could never be erased. Helene reached out and took Sophie's hand, offering a silent gesture of support. I understand, she said softly. I lost someone too. My fiancé. He died at Verdun. Sophie looked at her, her eyes filled with a shared understanding of loss. We are sisters in grief, she whispered. Helene nodded. But Etienne, he might still be alive, she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Missing doesn't mean dead. There's still hope. Sophie's eyes widened, a flicker of hope rekindled in their depths. You think so?
Ido, Helene replied firmly.
And I'm going to find him. I promise you. As Helene was about to leave, Sophie suddenly remembered something. There was one person, she said, her brow furrowed in thought, who might know something. A midwife. She helped deliver Etienne. She was a close friend of his mother's, and she knew about us. Her name is Madame Leclerc. She lives near the Bastille. Another name. Another lead. Helene felt a surge of excitement. The midwife. A woman who had been present at Etienne's birth. A woman who had known his secrets. Perhaps she held the key to unlocking the mystery of his disappearance. Perhaps she possessed forbidden knowledge, information that could lead Helene to Etienne, to the truth of what had happened to him on the battlefields of France. Helene thanked Sophie, promising to keep her informed, and stepped out into the night, the scent of lilies and roses following her, a fragrant reminder of the love and loss that intertwined their lives, and a beacon guiding her towards the next chapter in her quest. Chapter 7. Beneath the weeping willows of war. Madame Leclerc lived in a small, unassuming apartment above a butcher shop, the air thick with the scent of raw meat and dried herbs. The building was old, its walls leaning precariously, as if weary from bearing witness to the city's turbulent history. Helene climbed the narrow, creaking staircase, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The midwife, a woman in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted Helene with suspicion. She was small and wiry, her hands gnarled from years of delivering babies and tending to the sick. Her apartment was cluttered but clean, filled with the tools of her trade, bottles of herbal remedies, stacks of clean linens, and a worn leather bag containing her instruments. Helene explained her connection to Etienne, her discovery of the locket, the unsent letters, and her determination to find out what had happened to him. She showed Madame Leclerc the photograph of Etienne and Sophie, hoping to trigger a memory, a spark of recognition. Madame Leclerc studied the photograph intently, her eyes narrowing. Etienne, she murmured, her voice raspy. I remember him well. A beautiful boy. And Sophie, a lovely girl. A tragic love story. She confirmed Sophie's account of the forbidden romance, the animosity between the families, the societal pressures that kept them apart. She spoke of Etienne's devotion to his mother, his quiet determination, his unwavering loyalty. He was a good man, Madame Leclerc said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. He didn't deserve what happened to him. Helene's heart quickened. What happened to him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Do you know? Madame Leclerc hesitated, her gaze shifting to the window, as if looking out at some distant, unseen horizon. I know some things, she said slowly. Things that were not meant to be known. She explained that she had continued to visit Marie Dubois, Etienne's mother, after he had left for the war. She had helped her cope with the anxiety, the fear, the constant worry that gnawed at her soul. She had also, on occasion, secretly delivered messages between Etienne and Sophie, acting as a go-between for their forbidden correspondence. After Etienne was reported missing, Madame Leclerc continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, Marie, she received a visit. From a man in uniform, an officer. Helene leaned forward, her senses on high alert. An officer? Do you know his name? Madame Leclerc shook her head. I never saw him. Marie wouldn't tell me his name. But she was different after that visit. Frightened. Distraught. She told me to stop looking for Etienne. To stop asking questions. She said it was too dangerous. Too dangerous. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. What had the officer told Marie? What secrets were being concealed? Marie, she gave me something, Madame Leclerc continued, her voice trembling slightly. She told me to keep it safe. To give it to Etienne, if he ever returned. Or to someone who was looking for him. She went to a small, wooden chest in the corner of the room and unlocked it. She reached inside and pulled out a small, tightly wrapped package. It was wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a piece of string. I don't know what's inside, Madame Leclerc said, her voice hesitant. Marie never told me, but she said it was important, that it would explain everything. Helene took the package, her hands trembling. It was surprisingly heavy, its contents a mystery. She carefully unwrapped the oilcloth, revealing a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary, and on the cover, in faded ink, was written a single name, Etienne. Helene opened the diary, her heart pounding in her chest. The first entry was dated shortly before Etienne's disappearance. His handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, as if he were writing under duress. I have discovered something terrible, Helene read aloud, her voice shaking. Something that could endanger us all. I cannot write the details here. It is too risky. But I must find a way to expose the truth. I fear for my life. I fear for Sophie's. I fear for my mother's. The shadows are closing in. I pray I can find a way out of this before it is too late. The diary entries that followed were cryptic, filled with veiled references and coded language. Etienne wrote of a conspiracy, a betrayal, a secret that reached the highest levels of the French military. He wrote of a network of spies, of double agents, of information being sold to the enemy. He mentioned a code name, the Weeping Willow. He wrote of a meeting, a rendezvous, a place where the truth would be revealed. The final entry, dated just days before he was reported missing, was chilling. I am being followed. I know they are watching me. I have made arrangements to deliver the evidence. To the right people. If I fail, if I disappear, someone must find this diary. Someone must expose the truth. The fate of France may depend on it. Helene closed the diary, her mind reeling. Etienne hadn't simply disappeared in the chaos of war. He had been silenced. He had stumbled upon a dangerous secret, a conspiracy that threatened to undermine the entire war effort. And he had paid the ultimate price. The Weeping Willow. The codename echoed in her mind, a sinister whisper from the shadows. It was a clue, a vital piece of the puzzle. But what did it mean? Where was this place? And who were the right people Etienne had intended to deliver the evidence to? The weight of his words, the urgency in his final plea, settled upon her, a burden and a driving force all at once. The diary itself felt like a ticking clock. Chapter 8. A Dance with a Phantom. The discovery of Etienne's diary transformed Helene's quest from a personal search for a lost soldier into a dangerous pursuit of a wartime conspiracy. The weight of his words, the urgency of his final plea, fueled her determination. She knew she was treading on treacherous ground, that the secrets Etienne had uncovered could still be deadly, even after the war had ended. She decided to share the diary's contents with Sophie, knowing that it would be painful for her, but also believing that she deserved to know the truth about Etienne's fate. Sophie read the diary with a mixture of horror and grief, her tears falling onto the pages, blurring the already faded ink. The confirmation of Etienne's deliberate silencing, rather than a random act of war, deepened her sorrow, but also ignited a fierce resolve to help Helene uncover the truth. "The weeping willow," Sophie said, her voice trembling. I think I know what it means." Helene looked at her, her heart pounding with anticipation. "What? Where?" Sophie explained that Etienne had often spoken of a small, secluded café near the Jardin des Plantes, a place where he and his fellow soldiers sometimes went to relax and unwind. The café was known for its large, weeping willow tree that grew in its courtyard, its branches draping over the tables, creating a sense of privacy and seclusion. "He said it was a place where secrets were whispered," Sophie recalled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where information was exchanged. Where deals were made." The Jardin des Plantes. Another piece of the puzzle. Helene felt a surge of adrenaline. It was a lead, a tangible place to start her investigation. The next evening, Helene and Sophie visited the Jardin des Plantes, a sprawling botanical garden filled with exotic plants and flowers. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms and damp earth. They found the café, tucked away in a quiet corner of the garden, its entrance almost hidden from view. The weeping willow tree was still there, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting long, dancing shadows across the courtyard. The café was dimly lit, its atmosphere smoky and intimate. A few patrons sat at the tables, engaged in quiet conversations. A lone pianist played a melancholic tune, his fingers gliding over the worn ivory keys. Helene and Sophie sat at a table in the corner, trying to blend in, their eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign, any clue that might connect to Etienne's diary. They ordered coffee, their hands trembling slightly. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing their observations, their suspicions. They noticed a group of men in one corner, their faces obscured by shadows, their voices low and conspiratorial. They noticed a waiter, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as if he were expecting someone or something. As they were about to leave, feeling discouraged and disheartened, a man approached their table. He was tall and imposing, with a stern face and piercing eyes. He wore a well-tailored suit, but there was something about him, a certain hardness, a hint of danger, that suggested he was not what he seemed. "Mademoiselle," he said, his voice smooth and polite, but with an underlying edge of steel. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. You were asking about Etienne Dubois?" Helene and Sophie exchanged a nervous glance. How had he known? Had they been followed? Who are you?" Helene asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "Let's just say I'm a friend. A friend of Etienne's." "I know what happened to him." Helene's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Could he be trusted? Or was he one of the shadows Etienne had written about in his diary? What do you know?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man leaned closer, his eyes locking onto theirs. "I know that he was involved in something dangerous. Something that got him killed. And I know that you were playing with fire." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing them, judging them. "I can help you," he continued, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I can tell you the truth about Etienne. But it will cost you." Helene and Sophie exchanged another glance. They were caught in a web of intrigue, a dance with a phantom, a dangerous game where the stakes were high and the rules were unknown. They had a choice to make. Trust this mysterious stranger and risk everything, or walk away and abandon their quest for the truth. The music seemed to swirl around them. What do you want?" Helene asked, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. The man smiled again, his eyes gleaming with a hint of triumph. "Information," he said softly. "Information about the weeping willow. About who else knows about Etienne's discoveries." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He was testing them, pushing the boundaries of their commitment. The café seemed to fade into the background. Chapter 9. The Stolen Photograph and Its Secrets. The man, who introduced himself only as Monsieur Moreau, a common enough name to raise suspicion, Helene thought, mirroring the kind neighbor, claimed to have been a fellow intelligence officer working in a parallel, but separate, unit from Etienne. He painted a picture of a clandestine world of espionage and counter-espionage, where double agents and informants moved through the shadows, their loyalties constantly shifting. He confirmed Etienne's suspicions of a high-level conspiracy, a network of French officers selling military secrets to the Germans. He claimed that Etienne had stumbled upon evidence, proof of their treachery, and had been about to expose them when he was silenced. He was too close to the truth, Monsieur Moreau said, his voice low and urgent. They couldn't risk him revealing what he knew, so they eliminated him. He refused to reveal the identities of the conspirators, claiming it was too dangerous. He insisted that he needed Helene and Sophie's help to gather more information, to find the missing pieces of the puzzle, before he could expose them. He wanted them to continue investigating the Weeping Willow, to find out who else knew about Etienne's discoveries, to identify any potential contacts or informants. Helene was wary. His story was plausible, but there was something about him, a certain slickness, a calculated ambiguity, that made her uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back, that he was manipulating them for his own purposes. Sophie, however, was more trusting. Desperate for answers, for justice for Etienne, she was willing to believe him, to follow his lead. She argued that they had no other choice, that Monsieur Moreau was their only hope of uncovering the truth. Helene reluctantly agreed to cooperate, but she insisted on taking precautions. They would meet Monsieur Moreau only in public places, never alone. They would share information carefully, revealing only what was absolutely necessary. And they would continue their own investigation, independently of him, to verify his claims and to search for any clues he might be withholding. Over the next few days, Helene and Sophie returned to the Weeping Willow Café, observing the patrons, listening to conversations, trying to identify any potential links to Etienne's conspiracy. They discovered that the café was a known meeting place for military personnel, intelligence officers, and informants. It was a hub of whispered secrets, a place where information was bought and sold, where loyalties were tested and betrayed. They identified several individuals who seemed suspicious, men who met regularly in secluded corners, who exchanged furtive glances, who spoke in coded language. They followed them, discreetly, mapping their movements, noting their contacts, trying to piece together the network of espionage that Etienne had uncovered. One evening, while searching through Etienne's belongings that Madame Leclerc had given her, Helene discovered a hidden compartment in his old army trunk. Inside, she found a small, black and white photograph. It was a picture of Etienne standing in front of the Weeping Willow Café with a group of other soldiers. The photograph was slightly blurred, but Helene could make out the faces of the men. And one of them, standing next to Etienne, was Monsieur Moreau. Helene's heart sank. The photograph confirmed her suspicions. Monsieur Moreau was not who he claimed to be. He had been part of Etienne's unit, but he had lied about their relationship. He had been involved in the conspiracy, and he was now trying to use Helene and Sophie to cover his tracks, to eliminate any remaining evidence that could implicate him. She showed the photograph to Sophie, who was initially devastated, her hopes of finding justice for Etienne shattered. But then, her grief turned to anger, a fierce determination to expose Monsieur Moreau and the other conspirators. They decided to confront him, to use the photograph as leverage, to force him to reveal the truth. They arranged a meeting at the Weeping Willow Café, choosing a busy time when there would be plenty of witnesses. They knew it was a risky move, but they were running out of options. When Monsieur Moreau arrived, he was surprised to see them waiting for him, their faces set in expressions of cold determination. Helene placed the photograph on the table between them. "We know who you are," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "We know you were involved in Etienne's death." Monsieur Moreau's face paled. He tried to deny it, to bluster his way out of it, but the photograph was undeniable proof. He was trapped. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice pleading. "It was complicated. I had no choice." Sophie stood up, her voice trembling with rage. "No choice?"
she cried.
"You betrayed him. You murdered him." The other patrons in the cafe began to stare, their conversations fading into silence. The pianist stopped playing. Monsieur Moreau was exposed, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. The stolen photograph, a silent witness to his betrayal, had sealed his fate. It was a moment of reckoning, a turning point in their quest for justice. But the danger was far from over. The secrets of the photograph were laid bare for all to see, and the consequences were looming, casting long, uncertain shadows across the room. Chapter 10. The Confession in the Ruined Chapel. The scene in the cafe escalated quickly. Monsieur Moreau, cornered and desperate, attempted to grab the photograph, but Helene was quicker. She snatched it away, holding it out of his reach. The other patrons, sensing the tension, began to move away, creating a circle of empty space around their table. "You won't get away with this," Helene said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "We know about the conspiracy. We know about the secrets you're hiding." Monsieur Moreau, realizing he was trapped, slumped back in his chair, his face a mask of defeat. He looked at Sophie, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I never wanted to hurt Etienne. He was my friend. But I was under pressure. They threatened me. They threatened my family." Sophie turned away, her body trembling with rage and grief. "Excuses," she spat. "You made your choice. You chose to betray him." Helene, seeing an opportunity to extract more information, pressed him further. "Who are they?" she demanded. "Who are the other conspirators? Tell us everything you know." Monsieur Moreau hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. He was surrounded, exposed, his secrets laid bare. He sighed, a long, shuddering breath. It's bigger than you think," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "It reaches the highest levels. Generals, politicians, even members of the government." He revealed the names of several high-ranking officials, men who were considered national heroes, men who had been instrumental in the war effort. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering, a betrayal that went far beyond a few rogue officers selling secrets. It was a systematic undermining of the French military, a web of deceit and corruption that had cost countless lives. "Etienne, he had proof," Monsieur Moreau continued, his voice trembling. "He had documents, letters, recordings. He was going to expose them all. That's why they silenced him." He explained that the Weeping Willow was not just a code name for the cafe, but also for the entire network of conspirators. It was a symbol of their hidden power, their ability to manipulate events from the shadows. "The evidence, it's still out there," Monsieur Moreau said, his eyes locking onto Helene's. "Etienne hid it. Somewhere safe. He knew they were coming for him. He made preparations." Helene's mind raced. Where had Etienne hidden the evidence? What had he done to protect it? Suddenly, Monsieur Moreau gasped, his eyes widening in terror. He looked past Helene, towards the entrance of the cafe. "They're here," he whispered, his voice choked with fear. "They know I've told you too much." Helene turned around, following his gaze. Two men, dressed in dark suits, were approaching their table, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Monsieur Moreau. They were not police officers. They were something else. Something far more dangerous. "Run!" Monsieur Moreau shouted, his voice rising in panic. "Get out of here." Helene and Sophie didn't hesitate. They grabbed the photograph and Etienne's diary and fled the cafe, pushing their way through the startled patrons. The two men pursued them, their heavy footsteps echoing behind them. They ran through the streets of Paris, their hearts pounding, their lungs burning. They ducked into alleyways, hid behind buildings, trying to lose their pursuers. The city, once a familiar refuge, had become a dangerous labyrinth. They finally found sanctuary in a small, ruined chapel, hidden away in a forgotten corner of the city. The chapel was abandoned, its roof partially collapsed, its walls covered in graffiti. But it offered a temporary refuge, a place to catch their breath, to regroup, to plan their next move. As they huddled together in the darkness, surrounded by the crumbling remnants of the past, Helene realized the full extent of the danger they were in. They were not just fighting for justice for Etienne, they were fighting for their own lives. They were up against a powerful, ruthless enemy, an enemy that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Sophie, still trembling from the chase, looked at Helene, her eyes filled with fear. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Helene took a deep breath, trying to calm her own racing heart. She looked around the ruined chapel, her gaze settling on a small, stone altar, hidden beneath a collapsed section of the roof. An idea, a desperate hope, flickered in her mind. Etienne, he was a religious man, she said, her voice thoughtful. He often spoke of his faith, of his belief in justice. Perhaps he hid the evidence somewhere like this. Somewhere sacred. The confession in the ruined chapel had changed everything. It had confirmed their worst fears, but it had also given them a new lead, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The chase had been terrifying, but it had also strengthened their resolve. They were not just victims, they were survivors. And they were determined to fight on, to uncover the truth, to bring the conspirators to justice, even if it meant risking everything. The very stones of the chapel seemed to echo with the weight of their burden, the silence amplifying the urgency of their mission. The altar called to them. Chapter 11. Echoes of gunfire and whispered promises. Inspired by the setting and Helene's hunch, they began a meticulous search of the ruined chapel. The air was thick with dust and the scent of damp stone, a ghostly reminder of the chapel's former glory. Moonlight filtered through the gaps in the collapsed roof, casting eerie shadows that danced across the crumbling walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the broken windows, sent shivers down their spines. They examined the altar, running their hands over its cold, smooth surface, searching for any sign of a hidden compartment, a loose stone, anything that might conceal Etienne's evidence. They checked the crumbling walls, tapping on the stones, listening for a hollow sound. They sifted through the rubble on the floor, their fingers brushing against broken pieces of stained glass, fragments of pottery, and the remnants of prayer books. Hours passed, and their initial hope began to dwindle. They found nothing. Doubt crept in, whispering insidious suggestions that they were on a fool's errand, that Etienne had hidden the evidence somewhere else, somewhere they would never find. Sophie, exhausted and discouraged, slumped against a wall, her head in her hands. Maybe we were wrong, she said, her voice filled with despair. Maybe it's not here. Helene, though equally disheartened, refused to give up. She remembered Etienne's letters, his unwavering faith, his belief in justice. She remembered the way he had described the Weeping Willow, a place of secrets, a place of betrayal. He had chosen this chapel, a place of sanctuary, a place of hope, for a reason. She walked back to the altar, her gaze fixed on a small, wooden crucifix that hung above it. The crucifix was old and weathered, its surface cracked and faded. But there was something about it, a certain detail that caught her eye. The figure of Christ, usually depicted with a crown of thorns, was instead wearing a small, intricately carved garland of weeping willow leaves. Helene's heart leaped. It was a subtle clue, a hidden message, a testament to Etienne's ingenuity. The Weeping Willow. It wasn't just a cafe, it wasn't just a network of conspirators. It was also a symbol of sorrow, of betrayal, but also of remembrance. She reached out and touched the crucifix, her fingers tracing the outline of the willow leaves. She felt a slight movement, a subtle shift in the wood. She pressed harder, and a small section of the crucifix popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled within a bed of faded velvet, was a small, rolled-up scroll of parchment, tied with a piece of string. Helene carefully removed the scroll, her hands trembling with anticipation. This was it. Etienne's evidence. the proof of the conspiracy. She unrolled the scroll, revealing a series of documents, written in Etienne's familiar handwriting. There were lists of names, dates, and locations. There were transcripts of intercepted conversations, detailing the sale of military secrets to the enemy. There were copies of letters, signed by high-ranking officials, authorizing the transfer of funds to known German agents. The evidence was damning, irrefutable. It confirmed everything Monsieur Moreau had told them and more. It exposed a network of corruption that reached the very top of the French military, a betrayal that had cost countless lives and had prolonged the war. Sophie, who had been watching Helene with bated breath, gasped as she saw the documents. "He did it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and grief. "He really did it." As they examined the documents, they heard a noise outside the chapel. The sound of footsteps, approaching cautiously. They quickly extinguished their candle, plunging the chapel into darkness. They held their breath, listening intently. A voice, muffled and distorted, called out from outside. "They're in there. I know they're in there."
It was one of the men who had chased them from the cafe.
They had been found. Helene quickly rolled up the scroll and tucked it inside her coat. They had to escape, to protect the evidence, to get it to someone who could expose the truth.
But how?
The chapel was surrounded. They looked around the ruined chapel, searching for an escape route. There was a small, boarded-up window at the back, near the altar. It was their only hope. Helene grabbed a loose stone from the floor and began to pry at the boards, trying to create an opening. The wood was old and rotten, but it was still surprisingly strong. Sophie helped her, using a piece of broken pottery to scrape away at the wood. The footsteps outside grew closer. The voices grew louder. They were running out of time. Finally, with a loud crack, the boards gave way, creating a small opening, just large enough to squeeze through. Helene and Sophie scrambled through the opening, into the darkness outside. The sounds of pursuit were close. They found themselves in a narrow alleyway, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. They ran, their hearts pounding, their lungs burning. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew they had to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. The echoes of gunfire and whispered promises, both real and imagined, filled the night air, a constant reminder of the danger they faced and the love that fueled their desperate flight. The city was a maze once more. Chapter 12. The Serpent in the Sanctuary. The alleyway led them to a maze of narrow, winding streets, a labyrinth of shadows and hidden dangers. They could hear the shouts of their pursuers, echoing behind them, growing closer with each passing moment. They knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They needed a place to hide, a place to regroup and plan their next move. Sophie, who knew the neighborhood better than Helene, led them towards a nearby convent, a place of sanctuary, where she hoped they could find refuge. The convent, a large, imposing building surrounded by high walls, was a haven of peace and tranquility, a world away from the chaos and violence of the city streets. They reached the convent gates, which were locked and barred. Sophie frantically rang the bell, her heart pounding with desperation. After what seemed like an eternity, a small window in the gate opened, and a nun peered out, her face etched with concern. Sophie explained their plight, her voice trembling, her words tumbling over each other. She begged the nun to let them in, to offer them sanctuary, to protect them from their pursuers. The nun, after a moment of hesitation, agreed. She unbolted the gate, allowing Helene and Sophie to slip inside. The gate closed behind them with a heavy thud, shutting out the dangers of the outside world. They were led through a quiet courtyard, filled with the scent of lavender and roses, to a small, sparsely furnished room. The nun, whose name was Sister Agnes, brought them food and water, and offered them clean clothes. She listened to their story, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding. Helene and Sophie, exhausted and shaken, recounted their ordeal, their escape from the cafe, their discovery of Etienne's evidence, their flight through the city streets. They showed Sister Agnes the scroll, explaining its significance, its potential to expose the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. Sister Agnes, a woman of deep faith and unwavering conviction, was horrified by their story. She assured them that they were safe within the convent walls, that she would do everything in her power to protect them. "This is a house of God," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "No harm shall come to you here." But Helene, despite Sister Agnes's assurances, felt a growing sense of unease. There was something about the convent, a certain stillness, a hushed silence, that made her uncomfortable. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not as safe as they seemed, that danger still lurked, even within these sacred walls. Her suspicions were heightened when she noticed a small detail, a subtle clue that seemed out of place. In the corner of the room, on a small table, stood a vase of flowers. They were lilies, white and fragrant, a symbol of purity and innocence. But amongst the lilies, nestled discreetly amongst the petals, was a single sprig of weeping willow. Helene's blood ran cold. The weeping willow. It was everywhere, a constant reminder of the conspiracy, a symbol of the enemy that pursued them. How had it gotten here?
Who had placed it there?
She discreetly pointed out the willow to Sophie, who gasped in horror. They realized, with a chilling certainty, that they had been betrayed. The convent, their supposed sanctuary, was not safe. It was a trap. Sister Agnes, who had left the room to fetch them some tea, returned, her face serene, her eyes seemingly filled with kindness. But Helene and Sophie now saw her in a different light. They saw the serpent in the sanctuary, the wolf in sheep's clothing. "Drink your tea, my dears," Sister Agnes said, her voice smooth and soothing. "It will calm your nerves." Helene and Sophie exchanged a nervous glance. They knew the tea was likely poisoned, a subtle and deadly way to silence them forever. They had to escape, to get out of the convent before it was too late. But how? They were trapped, surrounded by nuns, their every move watched. They needed a plan, a clever ruse, a way to outwit their captors. The sanctuary had become a prison, the symbol of faith, a tool of betrayal. And the clock was ticking, the poison disguised as comfort, waiting to be consumed. The weeping willow sprig seemed to mock them. Chapter 13. The price of loyalty, the cost of love. Helene, thinking quickly, feigned a sudden illness. She clutched her stomach, groaning in pain, her face contorted in a grimace. "The tea, I think it was poisoned," she gasped, her voice weak and trembling. Sophie, playing along, rushed to her side, her face filled with alarm. "Sister Agnes, help us. She's been poisoned." Sister Agnes, her face initially registering concern, quickly betrayed a flicker of annoyance, a subtle tightening of her lips. She approached Helene, her eyes scrutinizing her with a cold, calculating gaze. "Nonsense," she said, her voice losing its soothing tone. "The tea is perfectly fine. You're just overwrought." But Helene continued her act, her performance becoming more dramatic, more convincing. She began to cough violently, her body shaking, her face turning pale. "She needs a doctor," Sophie cried, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, Sister Agnes, call a doctor." Sister Agnes hesitated, her mind clearly racing. She knew she couldn't allow a doctor to examine Helene, as it would expose her deception. But she also couldn't let Helene die in the convent, as it would attract unwanted attention. "Very well," she said, her voice grudging. "I will fetch some medicine. Stay here. Do not leave this room." She left the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Helene and Sophie waited until they were sure she was gone, then sprang into action. They searched the room frantically, looking for a way out. There were no windows, only a single, heavy door, which was undoubtedly locked. Their situation seemed hopeless. But then Helene noticed something. The vase of flowers, the one containing the sprig of weeping willow, was sitting on a small, wooden table. The table had a drawer. She pulled open the drawer, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside, she found a set of keys. They were old and rusty, but they looked like they might fit the door. She tried the keys, one by one, her hands trembling with urgency. Finally, one of the keys clicked in the lock. The door swung open. They slipped out of the room, their hearts racing, their senses on high alert. They crept down the corridor, listening for any sign of Sister Agnes or the other nuns. They reached the main hall of the convent, a large, dimly lit space with high, vaulted ceilings. They could hear the sound of chanting coming from a nearby chapel, where the nuns were gathered for evening prayers. They saw their chance. They dashed across the hall, towards the main entrance, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They reached the gate, their hands fumbling with the bolts. But just as they were about to open the gate, Sister Agnes appeared, her face contorted in rage. She held a long, sharp knife in her hand, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "You will not escape," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "You know too much." She lunged at Helene, the knife aimed at her heart. But Sophie, acting on instinct, stepped in front of Helene, shielding her from the blow. The knife plunged into Sophie's shoulder, the sharp blade piercing her flesh. Sophie cried out in pain, her body crumpling to the ground. Helene screamed, her heart filled with horror and despair. Sister Agnes, momentarily stunned by Sophie's sacrifice, hesitated. Helene seized the opportunity. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and swung it at Sister Agnes, striking her on the head. Sister Agnes collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Helene, her hands covered in Sophie's blood, knelt beside her friend, her heart breaking.
Sophie. Sophie.
"Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice choked with tears. Sophie, her face pale, her breathing shallow, managed a weak smile. "Go, Helene," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Get the evidence to safety. Expose them all." Helene, torn between her desire to stay with Sophie and her duty to fulfill Etienne's mission, made an agonizing choice. She kissed Sophie on the forehead, a silent promise to avenge her, to honor her sacrifice. She grabbed the scroll of documents and fled the convent, leaving Sophie in the care of the other, hopefully untainted, nuns, praying that they would help her. She ran through the streets of Paris, her heart pounding, her lungs burning. The price of loyalty, the cost of love, had been paid in blood. Sophie's sacrifice had bought her time, a precious window of opportunity to expose the truth. But the danger was far from over. The conspirators were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to silence her. The city felt colder, more menacing. Chapter 14. A Trail of Blood and Lavender. Helene ran blindly through the darkened streets, the image of Sophie's sacrifice seared into her mind. The sounds of the city, the distant rumble of traffic, the occasional shout, the clatter of horses' hooves faded into a dull roar, drowned out by the pounding of her own heart. She clutched Etienne's documents to her chest, the parchment a fragile shield against the forces arrayed against her. She knew she couldn't go back to her apartment, nor could she risk seeking help from anyone she knew. The conspirators' reach was long, their influence pervasive. She was alone, hunted, and desperately in need of a safe haven. Then she remembered Madame Moreau, the elderly neighbor of Etienne's mother. The woman had been kind, helpful, and seemed genuinely sympathetic to her cause. More importantly, she lived outside the immediate circle of Helene's acquaintances, making her less likely to be under surveillance. Helene made her way to the Canal Saint-Martin, her steps faltering, her body aching from the exertion and the emotional toll of the night's events. The familiar scent of the water, usually a comfort, now seemed tinged with the metallic tang of blood and the cloying sweetness of betrayal. She found Madame Moreau's apartment building, its facade dark and silent. She climbed the stairs, her legs heavy, her breath ragged. She knocked softly on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. After what seemed like an eternity, the door creaked open. Madame Moreau, her face etched with concern, peered out. "Helene? My dear girl, what is it? What's happened?" Helene, unable to speak, simply held up her blood-stained hands, her eyes filled with tears. Madame Moreau gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She quickly pulled Helene inside, closing and bolting the door behind her. In the dim light of Madame Moreau's small apartment, Helene recounted the night's events, her voice trembling, her words punctuated by sobs. She told her about the convent, about Sister Agnes, about Sophie's sacrifice. She showed her the documents, Etienne's evidence, the proof of the conspiracy. Madame Moreau listened intently, her face a mixture of horror and disbelief. She tended to Helene's wounds, cleaning and bandaging the scrapes and bruises she had sustained during her escape. She brewed her a strong cup of herbal tea. Its familiar lavender sent a small comfort in the midst of chaos. "My poor child," Madame Moreau said, her voice filled with compassion. "You've been through so much, but you're safe now. You're safe here." Helene, exhausted and emotionally drained, wanted to believe her. But she knew the danger was far from over. The conspirators would be looking for her, and they wouldn't rest until they had silenced her and retrieved the documents. "We need to get this evidence to someone who can expose them," Helene said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "Someone in authority, someone who can't be bought or intimidated." Madame Moreau nodded, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I know someone," she said slowly. "Someone who might be able to help. A journalist. A man named Antoine Dubois." Helene's heart skipped a beat.
Dubois.
The same surname as Etienne. Could it be a coincidence? He's a distant relative of Etienne's, Madame Moreau explained. "A cousin, I believe. He's a good man. Honest and courageous. He writes for an independent newspaper, one that's not afraid to challenge the powerful." Madame Moreau explained that Antoine had been investigating rumors of corruption within the military for some time, but he had lacked concrete proof. Etienne's documents, she believed, could be the key to breaking the story, to exposing the conspiracy and bringing the perpetrators to justice. They decided to contact Antoine immediately. Madame Moreau knew where he lived, a small apartment near the offices of his newspaper. They would go there in the morning, under the cover of darkness, hoping to avoid detection. Helene spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, her mind racing, her body aching. She couldn't shake the image of Sophie, lying wounded on the floor of the convent, her blood staining the sacred ground. She prayed that Sophie was still alive, that she would receive the medical attention she needed. As dawn approached, Helene and Madame Moreau prepared to leave. They dressed in simple, inconspicuous clothes, hoping to blend in with the early morning crowds. Helene carefully concealed the documents beneath her coat, her hand resting on them protectively. They stepped out into the street, the air cool and crisp. The city was slowly awakening, its streets beginning to stir with life. But for Helene, the world had changed. It was no longer a place of familiar comforts, of everyday routines. It was a battlefield, a place of hidden dangers and deadly secrets. A trail of blood and lavender marked her path, a testament to the sacrifices made, the battles fought, and the truth that still waited to be revealed. The city felt heavy, expectant. Chapter 15. The Spy's Deception, the Lover's Betrayal. Antoine Dubois, a man in his late 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a weary demeanor, lived in a modest apartment above a printing shop, the air thick with the scent of ink and paper. The room was cluttered but organized, filled with books, newspapers, and stacks of documents. It was the workspace of a man dedicated to his craft, a man who sought truth in a world of lies. Helene and Madame Moreau arrived at his doorstep just as the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the city. Antoine, after a moment of initial surprise, ushered them inside, his eyes filled with concern as he saw Helene's bandaged hands and the haunted look in her eyes. Helene recounted her story, her voice trembling as she described the events of the past few days, her encounter with the silhouette, her discovery of Etienne's letters, her meeting with Sophie, the confrontation with Monsieur Moreau, the escape from the convent, and Sophie's sacrifice. Antoine listened intently, his expression growing graver with each detail. He examined Etienne's documents, his brow furrowed in concentration, his fingers tracing the lines of faded ink. He recognized the names of some of the high-ranking officials implicated in the conspiracy, men he had long suspected of corruption, but had never been able to prove. This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and anger. This is the evidence I've been looking for. This could bring them down. All of them. He explained that he had been investigating rumors of a network of spies within the French military for months, but he had been stymied by a lack of concrete proof. He had faced opposition from his superiors, who were reluctant to believe that such high-ranking officials could be involved in treason. Etienne, he was a brave man, Antoine said, his voice filled with respect. He risked everything to expose the truth. And Sophie, she was a hero. We owe it to them to finish what they started. Helene, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose, nodded in agreement. We will, she said, her voice firm. We won't let their sacrifices be in vain. Antoine outlined his plan. He would publish the documents in his newspaper, exposing the conspiracy to the public. He would also contact his sources within the government, honest officials who could be trusted to investigate the matter and bring the perpetrators to justice. But then, Antoine revealed a shocking piece of information, a twist that turned Helene's world upside down. There's something else you should know, he said, his voice hesitant. Something about Etienne and Sophie. He explained that, according to his sources, Sophie's father, the wealthy industrialist, had not only disapproved of her relationship with Etienne, but had actively worked to sabotage it. He had used his influence to ensure that Etienne was assigned to a dangerous frontline unit, hoping that he would be killed in action. But that wasn't all. He also had evidence that Sophie had been informing on Etienne. She had been passing information about his movements, his contacts, his investigations, to her father, who had then relayed it to the conspirators. Helene was stunned, her mind reeling.
Sophie? A spy?
A betrayer? It couldn't be true. She had seen the love in Sophie's eyes, the grief in her voice, the sacrifice she had made. I don't believe it, Helene said, her voice trembling. Sophie loved Etienne. She would never have betrayed him. Antoine sighed, his expression filled with sadness. I know it's hard to accept, he said. But the evidence is compelling. There are letters, transcripts of conversations. It seems that Sophie was playing a double game. She was trying to protect Etienne, but she was also loyal to her father. He explained that Sophie's father had manipulated her, using her love for Etienne as a weapon. He had threatened to expose Etienne's involvement in the conspiracy, to ruin his reputation, to have him imprisoned, if she didn't cooperate. Sophie, caught between her love for Etienne and her loyalty to her father, had made a desperate choice. She had become an informant, hoping to protect Etienne by feeding her father carefully selected information, misleading the conspirators, buying Etienne time. But in the end, her deception had failed. Helene felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The woman she had admired, the woman she had considered a friend, a sister in grief, had been a spy, a betrayer. The cost of love had been even higher, even more twisted, than she had imagined. Everything felt tainted. Chapter 16. The Unveiling of Masks. The revelation of Sophie's double life shattered Helene's perception of reality. The narrative she had constructed, the bonds of trust she had forged, crumbled around her. The pain of Sophie's apparent betrayal was compounded by the guilt she felt for misjudging her, for failing to see the truth beneath the surface. Antoine, sensing Helene's turmoil, offered a different perspective. He suggested that Sophie's actions, while undeniably deceptive, were motivated by a complex mix of love, fear, and desperation. She had been caught in an impossible situation, forced to make agonizing choices, with no clear path to safety or justice. She was a victim, too, Antoine said, his voice gentle. A victim of her father's manipulation, of the conspirators' ruthlessness, of the war's cruel realities. He urged Helene not to judge Sophie too harshly, to consider the immense pressure she had been under, the impossible choices she had faced. He reminded her of Sophie's sacrifice at the convent, her willingness to risk her life to protect Helene and the evidence. That was not the act of a betrayer, Antoine said firmly. That was the act of a woman who, despite everything, still cared deeply about Etienne, about justice, about doing what was right. Helene, though still struggling to reconcile Sophie's actions with her own perception of her, began to see the situation in a new light. She realized that Sophie's story was not one of simple betrayal, but of a complex and tragic web of conflicting loyalties, of love and loss, of fear and courage. They decided to proceed with their plan to expose the conspiracy, but with a renewed sense of caution. They knew they couldn't trust anyone completely, that the conspirators had infiltrated every level of society, even the institutions that were meant to uphold justice. Antoine began to prepare the documents for publication, carefully editing them to protect their sources and to ensure the maximum impact. He contacted his network of trusted journalists and officials, sharing the evidence with them, urging them to act quickly and decisively. Helene, meanwhile, decided to visit Sophie in the hospital. She needed to confront her, to hear her side of the story, to understand the motivations behind her actions. She needed to see, with her own eyes, if the woman she thought she knew was a fiction or something more. She found Sophie in a small, private room, her shoulder bandaged, her face pale and drawn. She was weak, but conscious. When she saw Helene, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt, shame, and relief. Helene sat beside her bed, her heart aching for the woman who had been both her friend and her betrayer. She didn't accuse. She didn't condemn. She simply asked, her voice soft and gentle, "Why, Sophie? Why did you do it?" Sophie, her voice trembling, began to tell her story. She confirmed Antoine's account of her father's manipulation, of his threats, of her desperate attempts to protect Etienne. She explained that she had never intended to harm him, that she had always believed she could control the situation, that she could outwit the conspirators. "I was so naive," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could play their game, that I could use their own methods against them. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." She explained that she had genuinely loved Etienne, that she had dreamed of a future with him, a future free from the shadows of war and the constraints of their family's animosity. She had believed that by cooperating with her father, she could buy them time, that she could eventually find a way to expose the conspiracy and escape with Etienne. "I wanted to protect him," she said, her voice choked with sobs. "I wanted to save him, but I ended up destroying him." Helene listened, her heart breaking for Sophie, for the impossible choices she had been forced to make, for the devastating consequences of her actions. She saw the truth in Sophie's eyes, the genuine remorse, the deep, abiding love for Etienne that had been twisted and corrupted by the forces arrayed against them. Helene reached out and took Sophie's hand, offering a silent gesture of forgiveness, of understanding. "I know," she said softly. "I know you loved him." The unveiling of masks had been painful, brutal, but it had also been necessary. It had revealed the complex and often contradictory nature of human motivations, the blurred lines between loyalty and betrayal, the devastating impact of war on individual lives. It had shown Helene that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, love, in its many forms, could still endure. The room felt heavy. Chapter 17. The Reckoning at Dawn. With Sophie's confession and the impending publication of Etienne's documents, the stage was set for a final confrontation with the conspirators. Antoine had arranged for the story to break in the morning edition of his newspaper, a move that would send shockwaves through the city and force the authorities to act. They knew the conspirators would not go down without a fight. They were powerful, influential men, with access to resources and a willingness to use violence to protect their interests. Helene and Antoine had to be prepared for a backlash, a desperate attempt to silence them and suppress the truth. Antoine had taken precautions, arranging for safe houses for Helene and Madame Moreau and securing protection from his network of trusted contacts within the police force. He had also alerted several international journalists, ensuring that the story would receive widespread attention, making it more difficult for the conspirators to cover it up. Helene, despite the risks, insisted on being present when the story broke. She wanted to see the faces of the conspirators, to witness their downfall, to ensure that justice was served for Etienne, for Sophie, and for all the other victims of their treachery. They gathered at Antoine's apartment before dawn, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The printing presses downstairs were already running, churning out thousands of copies of the newspaper, each one a weapon of truth aimed at the heart of the conspiracy. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the sky, Antoine received a phone call. It was one of his contacts within the police force, informing him that arrest warrants had been issued for the conspirators. The police were moving in, preparing to raid their homes and offices. But then, another call came, this one from a different source. It was a warning. The conspirators had been tipped off. They were fleeing the city, preparing to go into hiding. Antoine slammed the phone down, his face grim. "They know," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Someone betrayed us. Someone within the police force." Helene's heart sank. The conspirators were escaping, slipping through their fingers. Justice seemed to be slipping away. But Antoine was not ready to give up. He had a plan, a desperate gamble, a way to intercept the conspirators before they could disappear. He knew that one of the key figures in the conspiracy, a general named Dubois, a cruel twist of fate, sharing Etienne's surname, but no relation, owned a private airfield outside the city. He suspected that the conspirators would be heading there, hoping to flee the country by plane. "We have to stop them," Antoine said, his voice determined. "We have to get to the airfield before they take off." They raced to the airfield, driving through the deserted streets of Paris in Antoine's battered old car. The sky was beginning to lighten, the dawn breaking over the city, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the rooftops. They arrived at the airfield just as the conspirators' plane, a small, single-engine aircraft, was preparing to take off. The engine was roaring, the propeller spinning, creating a whirlwind of dust and debris. Antoine drove the car onto the runway, directly in front of the plane, blocking its path. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching, the car coming to a halt just yards from the spinning propeller. The conspirators, seeing their escape route blocked, scrambled out of the plane, their faces filled with rage and desperation. General Dubois, a tall, imposing figure with a cruel, hawk-like face, stepped forward, a pistol in his hand. "Get out of the way," he shouted, his voice hoarse with anger. "This is your last chance." Antoine stood his ground, his hands raised, showing that he was unarmed. "It's over, General," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The truth is out. You can't escape justice." General Dubois sneered. "You think you can stop us? You're just a journalist. A pawn." He raised his pistol, aiming it at Antoine. Helene, seeing the danger, screamed. But before the general could fire, a shot rang out. It came from the side, from behind a nearby hangar. The general staggered, his hand flying to his chest, the pistol falling to the ground. He collapsed, his body crumpling onto the tarmac. Helene and Antoine turned to see who had fired the shot. It was Sophie. She was standing there, her arms still bandaged, her face pale but determined. She held a small pistol in her hand, the barrel still smoking. She had followed them, somehow managing to escape from the hospital and make her way to the airfield. She had arrived just in time to save Antoine's life, to deliver a final, decisive blow against the conspirators. The other conspirators, seeing their leader fall, surrendered. The police, alerted by Antoine's earlier call, arrived moments later, taking them into custody. The reckoning at dawn had been swift and brutal. The conspiracy had been exposed, the perpetrators brought to justice. But the cost had been high. General Dubois was dead. Sophie's actions were a redemption, but also another burden on her conscience. The weight of it all settled over them. The rising sun casting long shadows, a promise of a new day, but also a reminder of the darkness they had faced. The airfield was silent, save for the distant sirens. Chapter 18. Flight from the Ghosts of the Past. The aftermath of the airfield confrontation was a whirlwind of activity. The conspirators were arrested, their crimes exposed in Antoine's newspaper, causing a national scandal. The government launched a full-scale investigation, promising to root out corruption and bring all those involved to justice. Sophie, despite her injuries, was hailed as a hero. Her actions at the airfield, her willingness to risk her life to stop the conspirators, redeemed her in the eyes of the public, erasing the stain of her earlier betrayal. However, She still faced questioning and potential legal repercussions for her involvement, however nuanced. Helene, though relieved that the conspiracy had been exposed, felt a deep sense of sadness and exhaustion. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with danger, betrayal, and loss. She had uncovered the truth about Etienne's death, but the truth had been far more complex and painful than she could have imagined. She visited Sophie in the hospital, where she was recovering from her gunshot wound. The two women, bound together by their shared grief and their intertwined destinies, spoke honestly and openly, sharing their feelings of guilt, regret, and hope. Sophie expressed her deep remorse for her actions, for the harm she had caused Etienne, however unintentional. She acknowledged that she had made terrible choices, driven by fear and a misguided loyalty to her father. Helene, in turn, offered her forgiveness, recognizing the immense pressure Sophie had been under, the impossible situation she had faced. She acknowledged that Sophie's actions, while flawed, had ultimately been motivated by a desire to protect Etienne, to save him from the conspirators' clutches. They made peace with each other, and with the ghosts of the past. They knew that their lives would be forever marked by the events of the war, by the loss of Etienne, by the sacrifices they had made. But they also knew that they had survived, that they had emerged from the darkness stronger and more resilient. As Helene prepared to leave the hospital, Sophie asked her about Etienne's silhouette, the ghostly apparition that had first drawn Helene into the mystery. Do you still see him?" Sophie asked, her voice hesitant. Helene shook her head.
"No," she said softly. "He's gone."
I think he found peace. He knows the truth is out. His mission is complete." Helene realized that the silhouette had been a manifestation of Etienne's unfinished business, his desperate plea for justice. Now that the truth had been revealed, his spirit could finally rest. With the conspiracy exposed and the conspirators brought to justice, Helene felt a need to escape, to leave Paris, to distance herself from the memories and the trauma of the past few months. She decided to return to her hometown, a small village in the countryside, where she could find solace and healing in the familiar surroundings of her childhood. She sold her apartment in the Marais, packed her belongings, and said goodbye to Madame Moreau, who had become a dear friend and confidant. She promised to stay in touch, to visit often. As she boarded the train, leaving Paris behind, she looked out the window, watching the city's skyline fade into the distance. She felt a sense of closure, of resolution. She had fulfilled her promise to Etienne, to Sophie, to herself. She had uncovered the truth, exposed the conspiracy, and brought the perpetrators to justice. But she also felt a sense of emptiness, of loss. The journey had taken its toll, leaving her emotionally drained and scarred. She knew that the healing process would be long and difficult, but she was determined to move forward, to rebuild her life, to find a new purpose. The train rumbled through the countryside, the landscape changing from urban sprawl to rolling hills and verdant fields. Helene closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic motion of the train soothe her weary soul. She was fleeing from the ghosts of the past, but she was also carrying them with her, etched in her memory, a constant reminder of the sacrifices made, the love lost, and the truth revealed. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing she knew. She would keep moving one step at a time. She had a life to rebuild. Chapter 19. A new beginning, a fragile hope. Helene's return to her childhood village was a bittersweet homecoming. The familiar sights and sounds, the church bells ringing, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the bakery, the children playing in the village square brought a sense of comfort and nostalgia, but also a sharp pang of loss. Her parents were gone, their house sold, their memory fading with the passage of time. She rented a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, a simple dwelling with a garden overgrown with wildflowers. She spent her days tending to the garden, planting vegetables and herbs, finding solace in the quiet rhythm of nature. She took long walks in the surrounding countryside, breathing in the fresh air, letting the beauty of the landscape soothe her troubled soul. She slowly began to reconnect with the villagers, re-establishing old friendships, forging new ones. She found work as a seamstress, using her skills to create and repair clothes for the local community. She kept to herself mostly, her past a carefully guarded secret, her heart still heavy with grief and the weight of her experiences. She wrote to Sophie and Madame Moreau regularly, sharing her progress, offering her support, and receiving their encouragement in return. Sophie was slowly recovering from her injuries, but the legal proceedings against her were still ongoing. She faced an uncertain future, but she was determined to rebuild her life, to atone for her past mistakes. Months passed, and the seasons changed. The vibrant colors of summer faded into the golden hues of autumn, then into the stark, white landscape of winter. Helene found a measure of peace in the quiet routine of village life, but the memories of Paris, of Etienne, of the conspiracy, still haunted her dreams. One spring morning, as she was working in her garden, she received a letter from Antoine Dubois. It was an invitation to attend a ceremony in Paris, a dedication of a new monument honoring the soldiers who had died in the war, including those who had been victims of the conspiracy. Etienne's name would be among those engraved on the monument. Helene hesitated. She was reluctant to return to Paris, to face the ghosts of her past, to relive the trauma she had experienced. But she also felt a sense of obligation, a duty to honor Etienne's memory, to witness the recognition of his sacrifice. She decided to go. She packed a small bag, booked a train ticket, and prepared herself for the emotional journey. She wrote to Sophie, informing her of the ceremony and suggesting they meet in Paris. When Helene arrived in Paris, she was struck by the changes that had taken place. The city seemed brighter, more vibrant, its scars healing, its spirit renewed. The atmosphere was one of hope and optimism, a stark contrast to the darkness and despair she had experienced during her previous time there. She met Sophie at the hotel, where they were both staying. The two women embraced, their reunion filled with a mix of joy and sadness. Sophie looked healthier, stronger, her spirit seemingly unbroken by her ordeal. The legal proceedings against her had been resolved, she told Helene, thanks in part to Antoine's testimony and the public support she had received. She had been exonerated, her name cleared. The next day, they attended the ceremony at the Place de la Concorde, the same location where Helene had first seen Etienne's silhouette, the place where her journey had begun. The new monument was a grand and imposing structure, a testament to the nation's gratitude for the sacrifices made during the war. As the names of the fallen soldiers were read aloud, Helene felt a surge of emotion. When Etienne's name was called, she closed her eyes, picturing his face, remembering his letters, his unwavering loyalty, his tragic fate. She looked at Sophie, who was standing beside her, her eyes filled with tears. They held hands, offering each other silent support, their shared grief a bond that transcended their past differences. After the ceremony, Helene and Sophie walked to the spot where the old, temporary monument had stood, the place where Helene had first seen the silhouette. The area was now empty, cleared for a new park, a space for reflection and remembrance. As they stood there, Helene felt a sense of peace, of closure. The ghosts of the past were still present, but they no longer haunted her. They were a part of her history, a reminder of the strength she had found, the courage she had displayed, the love she had witnessed. She looked at Sophie, and she saw a new beginning, a fragile hope for the future. They had both been through so much, but they had survived. They had found redemption, forgiveness, and a renewed sense of purpose. The city felt lighter, the future, uncertain but filled with a possibility it hadn't held before. It was a new spring, and the air was filled with the promise of rebirth. The lingering ghost had faded, replaced by a solid, enduring memory. Chapter 20. The Resurrection of Etienne Dubois. The sense of closure Helene felt was profound, but it was also incomplete. While the conspirators had been brought to justice, and Etienne's name honored, a nagging question remained. The official record still listed him as missing, presumed dead. There was no grave, no final resting place, no concrete proof of his fate. A few weeks after the ceremony in Paris, Helene received a letter that would change everything. It was from a small village in the Alsace region, near the German border, an area that had seen heavy fighting during the war. The letter was written by a farmer, a man named Jean-Pierre Leclerc. The letter began with an apology for the intrusion, and then proceeded to describe a discovery the farmer had made while plowing his fields. He had unearthed a small, metal box containing a soldier's identification tag, some personal effects, and a few letters. The identification tag belonged to Corporal Etienne Dubois. Helene's heart leaped into her throat. Could it be? Could he somehow have survived? The farmer explained that he had found Helene's name and address among Etienne's belongings, in a letter he had written to his mother but never sent. He had felt compelled to contact her, to inform her of his discovery. He also mentioned something else, something that sent a shiver down Helene's spine. He wrote that there was a local legend, a story passed down through generations, about a French soldier who had been found near death in the fields after a battle, his memory gone, his identity unknown. The villagers had taken him in, cared for him, and he had eventually settled in the village, marrying a local woman and starting a family. The soldier had never recovered his memory, but he had lived a long and happy life, always haunted by a sense of something missing, a past he could not recall. The soldier, the farmer wrote, had died a few years ago, peacefully, in his sleep. Helene immediately contacted Antoine Dubois, sharing the farmer's letter with him. Antoine, equally stunned by the news, agreed to accompany Helene to Alsace to investigate the farmer's claims, to see if this incredible story could possibly be true. They traveled to the village, a small, picturesque community nestled amidst rolling hills and vineyards. They met with Jean-Pierre Leclerc, a kind, weathered man with honest eyes. He led them to his farmhouse, where he showed them the metal box he had unearthed. Inside, Helene found Etienne's identification tag, his locket still containing the portraits of his mother and Sophie, a few faded photographs, and several unsent letters, including the one addressed to his mother, the one mentioning Helene's name. The letters were heartbreaking, filled with Etienne's longing for home, his love for his mother, and his growing despair as the war dragged on. He wrote of the horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost, the constant fear that gnawed at his soul. But it was the last letter, the one written just days before his disappearance, that truly captured Helene's attention. In it, Etienne described his discovery of the conspiracy, his determination to expose the truth, and his fear for his life. He mentioned a meeting he was planning, a rendezvous with someone he trusted, someone who could help him get the evidence to the right people. He wrote that he was being followed, that he knew his time was running out. The letter ended abruptly, unfinished. It was clear that Etienne had been interrupted, that he had been forced to flee, to hide, before he could complete his mission. Jean-Pierre then led Helene and Antoine to the village cemetery, to a small, unassuming grave. The headstone bore a simple inscription, Jean Dubois, beloved husband and father.
Jean,
Not Etienne. But the farmer insisted that this was the grave of the amnesiac soldier, the man who had been found near death in the fields, the man who had lived a long and happy life, never knowing his true identity. Helene stood before the grave, her heart aching, her mind reeling. Could this be Etienne? Could he have survived, lost his memory, and started a new life, oblivious to his past, to the love he had left behind? It all seemed too much to handle. As she stood there, an elderly woman approached the grave, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. She was small and frail, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. Jean-Pierre introduced her as Marie, the widow of Jean Dubois, the amnesiac soldier. Helene looked at the woman, searching her face for any sign of recognition, any hint of a connection to Etienne. Marie smiled gently at Helene, her eyes kind and welcoming. "You must be Helene," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "Jean, he often spoke of you. He said he felt a connection to you, a sense of familiarity. He couldn't explain it." Helene's heart skipped a beat. Etienne, or rather, Jean, had remembered her name, even without his memory. The connection between them, the inexplicable bond that had drawn her to his silhouette, had transcended time and space, even amnesia. Marie explained that Jean had always been haunted by a sense of something missing, a past he could not recall. He had recurring dreams, fragmented images of war, of a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, his mother, of a secret love, of a dangerous mission. He had never been able to piece together the fragments of his past, but he had found peace and happiness in his new life, in his marriage to Marie, in his children and grandchildren. Helene, overwhelmed with emotion, showed Marie the locket, the photographs, the letters. Marie recognized the locket instantly, her eyes filling with tears. She confirmed that it was identical to one Jean always carried, a treasured possession he could not explain. As Helene and Antoine left the village, they carried with them a sense of wonder, of disbelief, of profound sadness and unexpected joy. Etienne had been found, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a man who had lived, loved, and died, never knowing his true identity. His resurrection was not a literal one, but a resurrection of his story, of his life, of his legacy. It was a bittersweet ending, a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unpredictable, often miraculous, nature of fate. He was both gone and never truly gone. Epilogue. Years passed. Helene returned to her village, carrying the weight of Etienne's story, a story that was both tragic and miraculous. She had found him, not as the man she had imagined, but as a man who had lived a full life, albeit a life shrouded in the mystery of a lost past. She continued to correspond with both Sophie and Antoine. Sophie, having rebuilt her life, eventually married a kind, understanding man, a doctor who had treated her at the hospital. She never forgot Etienne, but she found a measure of peace and happiness in her new life. Antoine continued his work as a journalist, becoming a respected voice for truth and justice, always vigilant against corruption and abuse of power. He often visited Helene, their friendship deepening over the years, a bond forged in the crucible of their shared experience. Helene never married. She devoted her life to her craft, becoming a renowned seamstress, her creations sought after for their beauty and artistry. She found solace in her work, in the quiet rhythm of her days, in the simple pleasures of village life. But she never forgot Etienne. She kept his letters, his locket, his photograph, close to her heart, a reminder of the love that had been lost, the sacrifices that had been made, the truth that had been revealed. She often visited the local church, finding comfort in the familiar rituals, in the quiet stillness of the sanctuary. She would light a candle for Etienne, for Sophie, for all those who had been lost in the war, for all those who had suffered from the greed and ambition of others. One day, many years later, as Helene was sitting in her garden, enjoying the warm sunshine, she received a visit from a young woman. The woman introduced herself as Annette, the granddaughter of Jean Dubois, the amnesiac soldier from Alsace. Annette explained that she had been researching her family history, and she had discovered the story of her grandfather's mysterious past, his arrival in the village after the war, his lost memory, his new life. She had found Helene's name among her grandfather's belongings, in a letter he had written to his mother but never sent. Annette had traveled to Helene's village, hoping to learn more about her grandfather's past, to uncover the truth about his identity. She had brought with her a small, wooden box, a family heirloom, containing some of her grandfather's possessions. Helene invited Annette inside, her heart filled with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. She showed Annette Etienne's letters, his locket, his photograph. Annette recognized the locket instantly, her eyes widening in surprise. She opened the wooden box she had brought, and inside, nestled among other mementos, was a small, silver heart, identical to the one Etienne had worn. Annette explained that her grandfather had always carried the locket, never taking it off. He had told her it was a gift from someone special, someone he could not remember, but someone he knew he had loved deeply. As Annette examined Etienne's letters, she came across one that mentioned a secret meeting, a rendezvous he was planning with someone he trusted. The letter described the location of the meeting, a small, ruined chapel hidden away in a forgotten corner of Paris. Annette looked up at Helene, her eyes filled with excitement. "This chapel," she said, "it still exists. My grandfather, he drew a picture of it many years ago. He said he felt drawn to it, that it held a special significance for him." Annette showed Helene the drawing. It was a crude sketch, but it was unmistakably the same ruined chapel where Helene and Sophie had found Etienne's hidden documents, the place where they had faced their greatest danger, the place where Sophie had sacrificed herself to save Helene. Helene felt a surge of emotion, a profound sense of connection to Etienne, to his past, to his enduring spirit. Even in his amnesia, even in his new life, he had been drawn to the places that had held significance in his lost past, his subconscious memory guiding him, connecting him to the truth. Helene and Annette decided to visit the chapel together, to pay their respects to Etienne, to honor his memory, to complete the circle that had begun so many years ago. They traveled to Paris, finding the chapel, still standing, though even more dilapidated than before. They stood together in the silence, surrounded by the crumbling walls, the echoes of the past. Helene felt a sense of peace, of completion. She had found Etienne, not as the ghost she had first imagined, but as a man who had lived, loved, and died, his spirit enduring, his memory preserved. As they left the chapel, Helene knew that Etienne's story would live on, passed down through generations, a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unpredictable, often miraculous, nature of fate. The circle was complete. The past was present, and the future, unwritten, stretched before them, filled with the quiet strength of remembrance. The fading silhouette had become a vibrant tapestry of a life lived, lost, and found again. The end.